We're talking to Robin Koerner. Robin is something of an expert on the art of political persuasion. He's got a brand new book called If You Can Keep It, Why We Nearly Lost It and How We Get It Back. He was educated at Cambridge University, where he holds 3 degrees in physics and in the philosophy of science. Robin, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Tom. This is a privilege. Thank you.
What are you trying to paint here, and what do you want people to walk away from this book with?
Your listeners will not need telling that we have seen rights be whittled away quite extremely now. And it's there in the Declaration in the Constitution that it's up to we the people to prevent that from happening. But we the people seem to have not prevented that from happening. So this book asks why, in a quite deep way. What is it about our makeup, the makeup of our brains, the way we receive information from the media, process that information, the way we perceive the world and interpret the world? What is it about all of those things that stop us being able to see what is happening around us, especially with respect to our rights and the founding principles of this country? And a lot of us actually know things that are wrong. And the reason I'm writing a whole book on that is, if I can get the liberty movement to read this book and understand this stuff, they're going to understand better how to show what is so, the ways in which we are losing our rights, and the solutions that we need to implement society-wide. They're going to be better able to show those solutions and engage other folks in those solutions. In other words, we the people will start to be more effective in maintaining or regaining, depending on how you look at it, our rights.
You mentioned a reference to the Thomas Kuhn book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You talk about paradigm shifts. You have that interesting playing card experiment. I hate the word paradigm, but it is a helpful concept for this. So Explain what that's all about and throw that playing card example in there, because I like that.
Okay, so this was an experiment called the Perceptions of Incongruity experiment that was done in Harvard, I think the end of the 40s. They flashed at speed playing cards to participants, and the participants simply had to read out what they were seeing. So 6 of hearts, 7 of clubs, 3 of spades, whatever. Now, what the participants didn't know was that after they'd been doing this for a while, the red and black colors in the cards were switched. So there'd be a 7 of hearts, but it was black, or 3 of spades, but it was red. And what the experimenters wanted to see was what cards were called out, right? So if you see a black 7 of hearts, what actually do you see? Well, it turns out that you don't say, oh, hold on, that's a black 7 of hearts. You say simply 7 of hearts, or 7 of spades, or 7 of clubs. In other words, what you see is a function of what you know you're already looking at, which is a pack of playing cards. Now, in this case, the knowledge is wrong. They've seen a lot of playing cards. Okay, this is obviously a pack of playing cards. So they're in a playing card paradigm, and that determines not only how they interpret the world, but their very perceptions of the world. And of course, this is critical in politics. And the other interesting thing about this experiment is that the participants were hooked up to equipment that was registering their physiological stress responses. So looking at sweat and current on the skin, heart rate, and things like that. And as these folks were shown playing cards with the colors switched, they were consciously seeing something that wasn't there. And their bodies were registering stress. And the stress went rose and rose and rose. And this shows that we are very firmly wired to stick in our paradigms. And we don't want to change what we know. Now, what happens, of course, eventually is the rate at which these cards are shown is slowed down, and people get more and more uncomfortable, but they don't know why, until eventually, looking at a card long enough, they go, oh, hold on, that's not a real card. That's a black 7 of hearts. At that point, they are now released from the standard playing card paradigm, and they are able to see accurately everything that is shown to them. The lesson for politics, I hope, is obvious.
But in case it isn't, let's give a real flesh and blood example. Let's take Ron Paul, because he goes beyond a black 7 of hearts. He's like a Trivial Pursuit card in your playing card deck. So we've got this guy who's constitutionalist and he wants to cut spending, but he's also extremely anti-war. I don't even have the right categories to think about this correctly, so therefore he's crazy.
Right.
That became the refrain. He's crazy because he doesn't fit into my view. He's not a regular playing card. He's not a correct playing card.
That's exactly right. So we can't accommodate that data, right? We can't even, some folks can't even kind of perceive the data, can't accept it. So in the case of Ron Paul, he was kind of just marginalized. He was kind of outside the standard American political paradigm. And I would say, interestingly, one of the most powerful things that we can attribute to Ron Paul is that now bits of what he was doing and what he was saying have become mainstream, have started to get into mainstream American politics. If he was talking about audit the Fed on a debate stage 12 years ago, for example, no one would, what is this guy talking about? But now, a lot of folks who might not even identify libertarian can at least get that that's a meaningful thing. They're not going to completely glaze over. So he's kind of enlarged the paradigm towards liberty. This excluding of data that doesn't fit the paradigm is something we are quite firmly soft-wired to do. And it is exactly because that is the case that I needed to write this book for libertarians, right? Given that people are wired not to see what's so, it ain't any good just hitting them with more facts and logic, because the problem that's keeping us in tyranny is that people can't see what's so because they're stuck in their own paradigm. I trained in direct sales. And one way of looking at this book is that it's sales and marketing for those who are trying to sell and market the ideas of and philosophy of liberty. I already kind of had a skill in that area. And also at university, I studied epistemology, right? Which is the philosophy of knowledge and belief. How do we know the things that we know? And I've kind of self-taught in behavioral economics and all that, like empirical psychology and all that stuff. So I had kind of a bit of a grounding, you might say. In 2011, I was given the opportunity to write on the Huffington Post. And the Huffington Post is a mainstream outlet for folks on the left. And I was a liberal by default before I started reading Hayek and Hazlitt and all the good stuff, right? And what I mean by that is I never really given politics much thought. I'm a nice guy. There's this thing called government, this thing called law. Obviously, good policy manifests all my good intentions for a more just society, et cetera, right? Liberal by default. I didn't really have a commitment to a philosophy, but policy that more directly manifests my good intentions must be better than policy that doesn't. And I think a lot of liberals who don't care that much about politics actually feel that way. So I felt that way right up until I discovered the liberty canon. And I thought, well, okay, most of my friends are liberal by default, and I still remember how to speak that language. So I'm going to use this platform on the Huffington Post to tell all these Obama voters, good on them for sticking to their true liberal principles for voting for Obama the first time, but now you've seen what Obama's actually done in his first term, go vote, stay true to your liberal principles by voting for the one guy in the presidential race at that time who has a track record on civil rights, not getting into unnecessary wars, on standing up against crony corporatism. And that guy happens to be an old white conservative called Ron Paul. The movement, whose name I coined in this article, which was Blue Republican, as you mentioned, became the largest, numerically largest coalition for Ron Paul within about a week of that article. And it stayed the largest coalition for Ron Paul right up to the convention. So it had a huge effect. So the biggest coalition for Ron Paul was actually a bunch of Huffington Post moderates and leftists. Selling liberty isn't the hard bit. Liberty kind of sells itself. What you have to do is get somebody to unlearn whatever paradigm they have that stops them seeing what they need to see to be able to want their liberty or to realize that they haven't got their liberty. Politics can only do what the culture allows. Now, what is culture? Culture is the way people behave, their expectations, the way they react to things, the concept in their paradigm through which they understand the world and see the world. Because we in the liberty movement care about political ideas, we focus on politics and political philosophy. I mean, it's obvious that we would do so. And because we're not very good at sales and marketing, we think, well, if we just explain our politics well, then people will get it, and that will have a political effect. Culture precedes politics. We have to move the mainstream dial of culture, if you like. Culture is the dog and politics is the tail, and the dog wags the tail. Now, if you try and apply pressure to politics without moving the culture, nothing that you do is going to stick. Jefferson talked about the ultimate defense of liberty is informing the discretion of the people. I mean, there it is. Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, it's about we the people. Even the founders said it's about we the people. It's the demos of democracy. Now, this is important because libertarians and constitutionalists, and I love them, I'm one of them, rightly say we're a constitutional republic, not a democracy. And then they're kind of done with democracy. Well, yes, but also kind of no, because with a small d, our constitutional republic sits on democracy in this sense that it is up to the kratos of the demos. The power of the people must be exerted to make sure that these rights that are enumerated in the Constitution just aren't words on a piece of paper. It's actually what people do. what people demand, if libertarians can get a different relationship with democracy, they might do a lot better. If you have a spectrum of left to right and you control the middle guy or that small chunk in the middle, then you have the power to take away wins from the left and from the right. And if we as a movement can make the enlarging independent middle, skeptical, disaffected middle of American politics that doesn't identify Republican or Democrat anymore, if we can make them basically constitutionalists or classical liberals or libertarians or whatever you want to call it, then we can start moving the dial of culture. Politics always follows. In a way, we are kind of victims of our success being Americans, because I think a lot of folks say, well, it's all in the Constitution, so kind of the work's done. Well, the work isn't done, because the first words, we the people, are what it all sits on. And moving we the people means moving culture.
So how would you recommend that people do things differently from how they're doing them now? Give me a specific example.
All salesmen know this, that a sale is not made through facts and logic. Facts and logic only really work in changing somebody's mind when you are asked for them. And this comes down to a misunderstanding, because we think that judgment, the forming of judgments, and the justifications we use for our judgments are the same thing. And they're absolutely not. They're completely different processes in the brain. And we all sincerely believe that the reason we have our judgments is whatever reasons we give when we're justifying them to folks. But it turns out that 90% of how we get to our truth is nothing to do with the actual logical reasons that we fit post hoc to justify the truths that we end up at. There's a great quote, I can't remember who said it, but it goes, you can only find truth with logic when you've found truth without it. So you've got to understand the process by which people do change their minds. And so I'm explaining about paradigms, because how do you hack a paradigm? Well, a lot of it is, of course, finding common ground. So instead of explaining, here's why you're wrong, what you're much better off doing is finding the thing in your opponent's worldview that you can authentically consent to or assent to, and actually form some kind of relationship on that common ground. Because what you're trying to do is move the bar that somebody's going to have when listening to you espousing your libertarian views. Move it from, must I believe this? In other words, I'm disposed not to believe what this guy is telling me, to can I believe this? Which is, I'm disposed to believe what this guy's telling me. And I'm going to do that for emotional reasons. Because identify with this guy means, can I imagine what it's like to experience the world the way he experiences it? Do I trust this person's moral motivation? And you start to establish those things by having human connections. And a prerequisite for having human connections is not to try and win an argument, but try and win a supporter, try and win a friend. I say it's more like going on a date than winning a debate. So these are the kind of things that I'm talking about. And if we can reflect back on elements of the culture that people are already comfortable with and participating in, then we do not seem alien, which means that bar is moved from must I believe these guys to can I believe these guys? And when that bar is moved down, when there is that kind of emotional connection, then the accuracy of the argument becomes much less important. It is about human connection. It's about not alienating ourselves from all those crazy socialists, for example, or the liberals by default, or the neocons. If I'm on the left and I experience my support for a policy as coming from my good intention, and I see you disagreeing with the policy, then from my paradigm, my understanding of you is that you obviously don't have the good intention I have. So I'm now making some inference, but I'm making an inference about you from my paradigm. But my paradigm isn't the one you're working in. Because if I'm on the right, I may not believe that government and law works in the way that my friends on the left think. In other words, I might believe that the method of imposing the policy through government, force, law, is going to determine the outcome more than the intention of the policy. So I'm judging policies by actually looking at policies and saying this kind of policy gets this kind of outcome. And the outcome may not be obvious from the intention that went into the policy. So I'm looking at my friends on the left and I'm going, why can't they see that? Why can't they see that if you do this, you're going to get this outcome? My God, they must be stupid. Can't they look at facts? So the guy on the left is working on a moral kind of intentional axis, but the folks on the right might be working on a more kind of functional axis with their politics. Now, if I know that I'm going to be using different vocabulary and different arguments when I speak to the folks on the left and folks on the right. I'm going to make those people feel comfortable with me in very different ways. And indeed, I make the point that we shouldn't actually be seeking to win arguments. We should be seeking to win supporters. And they are very different processes, largely because the judgment forming process and the post hoc justification process, as I discussed earlier, are very different.
Check him out at robinkoerner.com.